My name is Sabrina Britt, and I'm with Yellow Basin Foundation. And I'm going to share screen with you tonight. And I will be your moderator while we're on here tonight. So here's my share screen. I want to take care of a logistical thing right now. If you have questions throughout our program today, feel free to send them to me. So if you hover over the bottom of your screen on Zoom or at the top, it's different for different people and different technologies. Your little toolbar will pop up and you can select the chat feature and choose to send your questions in to me, Yellow Basin Foundation, as it should probably says Yellow Basin Foundation host. And again, I'm Sabrina Britt. I'm the volunteer coordinator, and I'm here tonight to moderate the second of our series of 4 Vernal Pool speaker series. So we are Yellow Basin Foundation, and can you all just give me a thumbs up that you can see my screen that I'm sharing with you all? Okay, great. Just want to make sure that's going through for you. Yellow Basin Foundation is the nonprofit organization that is in charge of the educational outreach for the Yellow Bypass wildlife area. And our mission is to expand public appreciation and stewardship of wetlands and wildlife through education and innovative partnerships within the Yellow Basin. And the Yellow Bypass wildlife area sits within the greater Yellow Basin, which is a natural flood zone. And the Yellow Bypass wildlife area was restored wetlands, recreated wetlands in order to help with flood control, with wildlife conservation, with agriculture, and for recreational access. Tonight, we are bringing you our Vernal Pool speaker series. This is the second of 4. We kicked off on April 1st, which was the last of our speaker series. And I will at this time also ask everyone to just mute themselves so we don't hear background noises, because I can hear a little bit right now. So thank you. Sometimes it freezes like it just did, and it's momentary, and I'll pause, or CJ will pause when he is speaking so that we can make sure we continue when it's not frozen. Technology, we love it and we hate it, right? At the same time, but thank goodness for it during this time. So tonight, CJ will be speaking about Vernal Pool fairy shrimp and tadpole shrimp. And we had kicked this off with Eva Butler speaking about the vernal pools, the jewels of our wetlands, and the jewels of the valley, really. And so tonight, CJ is our second part. And we are doing this in conjunction with California Department of Parks and Recreation. Through a Habitat Conservation Fund grant program, we are partnering with Grasslands Regional Park to bring you the Vernal Pool speaker series. Grasslands Regional Park is located just south of the city of Davis along Mace Boulevard. It's right a mile south of Interstate 80. It is just a few miles southwest of the Yellow Bypass wildlife area. It is a 320-acre park that has a lot of natural resources that include our vernal pools, burrowing owl preserve, Swainson's hawks nesting sites, and other rare and endangered species, and 2 of which we're going to hear about tonight from CJ. Just a little bit of background about this if you didn't join us for our first of our 4 series. And a little background, this is a 5-year grant project from 2019 to 2023. And through Grasslands Regional Park Vernal Pool Habitat, we're doing public outreach and education. The grant scope is for us to do both student outreach, so student programs, as well as community programs. So for adults, for families, so for our local community. A little bit about the location. So here you can see, whoops, there we go. Here you can see kind of the big picture of where it's located. Give me a thumbs up if you can see my cursor moving around Davis. Great. So you can see where it sits just southeast of Davis. And over here you can see the Yellow Bypass Wildlife Area off of Childs. If we zoom in a little bit closer here, you can see that's where you park off of Tremont and Mace. And in here, there are archery ranges to the south and to the north. The dog park is down here. And there are trails that you can walk on out here in this area. There's a location where a plane flying society flies their toy planes. And the vernal pools are all out in this region here. Here's a close-up of the fenced-in area of the vernal pool on site, the main one that we are doing education on. Of course, this is an extremely dry year image. It's not a great look at what they look like when they're blooming, but you can see those through our programs like tonight and with our virtual vernal pool touring as well. So just to let you know what's coming up after CJ tonight and what we're doing here, there's the information on our website about our vernal pool speaker series. That's there for other ones. And our next one is on Tuesday, April 27th at 7 p.m. It'll be a two-part evening. We'll hear from Chris Alford on a history of Grasslands Regional Park and its vernal pools. And part two, we'll hear from John McNerney with the City of Davis on the burrowing owl preserve at Grasslands Regional Park. The next one after that, our last of the series, is on Tuesday, May 11th at 7 p.m. Plants of the Vernal Pools with Carol Witham, who is a botanist and vernal pool expert. Our virtual tours are online on our website as well, so you can definitely check those out if you enjoy tonight's talk and you'd like to learn more. And this shows you a little bit on our website what we're offering for students. So we have our virtual Discover the Flyway field trips that we do. And so if you have kids in the family, you work with other schools, CJ works with the schools, and so we'd love to have students get online with us for now, and hopefully next year we can offer these in person. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce CJ Addington. I'm going to spotlight CJ here, and CJ is a volunteer with Jepson, Prairie, and he is also a high school biology teacher. So he is working with our youth, and he is key to education and teaching our students about his love and passion of vernal pools. So CJ, I'm going to turn it over to you. I'm going to go mute, and please, as CJ talks, send in your questions to that chat feature, and I can field those to CJ at the last 10-15 minutes of our time together. Thank you, CJ.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you, Sabrina, and thank you to the YOLO Basin Foundation for inviting me to do this. I'm actually glad that they did. As many of you guys know, this spring, this winter have been very dry, and most of the vernal pools in the Northern California area are bone dry, and there's nothing going on in there. So I wasn't going to be doing any dipping this year. And so this is a nice opportunity for me to still experience the vernal pool things and share it with the public. So just to introduce myself, my name is CJ Addington. I am a science teacher at Roseville High School in Roseville, California. I've actually been at Roseville High for 28 years. So it's been a while. Okay, I started teaching there in 1993. I've also been a docent at the Jepson Prairie Preserve. I've been docenting there since 1998, so it's been about 23 years, working with the vernal pools, doing public tours, dipping, that sort of thing. And then, of course, aside from that, I am actually just sort of a fanatic about fairy shrimp. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my own life experience with fairy shrimp, why I'm into them, and why they're so cool, and hopefully share a little bit with you what is so amazing and fascinating about these little animals. Okay, so a couple things. Number one, this connection does look like it's a little bit glitchy, and so apologies for that. If it looks like I'm freezing, I will pause and wait for it to pick up, and then hopefully it'll just pick up again. And then, as Sabrina mentioned, I'm actually doing this from my classroom, and my classroom has motion sensor light. So if all of a sudden everything goes pitch black on my side, I'll just need to go walk in front of my motion sensor just quickly. So if I walk away from my screen for a moment and it's black, that's what I'm doing. And I will be right back, okay? All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and get started here. And like Sabrina said, if you have any questions, just put them in the chat, and I'll be happy to address some of those in a bit, okay? So let me start by talking a little bit about vernal pools. If you guys watched Eva's presentation earlier, she actually went over that. So you probably got a lot of this material already, but I wanted to kind of share a different view, okay? So I'm actually gonna do a screen share with you and show you a vernal pool, okay? So hopefully this is making sense and you can see this okay on your screen. Please let Sabrina know if there's any glitches with the visibility on this. But what you're looking at is actually a mini vernal pool that I keep in my classroom, and I have it under my camera next to my computer. So one of the things that I do as a fairy shrimp collector and fanatic is I actually have many glass trays of various species of fairy shrimp that I grow for my kids to use, for my kids to observe. And this is a tray that happens to be in its dry state. And actually that's appropriate because this is what most of California looks like at the moment. So if you go out to Grasslands Regional Park, Jepson Prairie, Mather Field, any of the local vernal pool habitats, this is what you're gonna see. So this is cracked clay. Clay shrinks when it dries and cracks into these giant strange abstract shapes. Now, what's interesting about this though, is that if I zoom in on it, what looks like just dead cracked clay is actually life waiting to happen. Because if I zoom in on the surface of this clay, what you can see, these little seed shaped objects that are visible there, those are actually the dead bodies of seed shrimps from the last generation that dried up when this pool dried up. But they're not dead forever because these are mostly females, and inside their bodies are the eggs of the next generation. So before they died, they produced a clutch of eggs. The eggs are now safely stored inside the dead corpse of their mothers, which sounds grisly, but is actually a very good way to protect them. Next time the rains come, or in this case, if I fill this pan with water, those little guys will hatch right out again. So I keep a whole bunch of these trays in my storeroom, ready to hatch at a moment's notice. So I keep them going at any time. Now, the next thing I want to show you though, is if you take this dried sediment, if I took it out of this pan that I'm running, or if I went out to a vernal pool habitat and scraped up some sediment, if you run sediments through a set of graduated sieves and collect what ends up on the 100 mesh sieve, you end up with what I'm going to show you next. So this talk is going to be a little bit of a show and tell. So it's going to be a bit of a classroom style show and tell. I hope you guys don't mind. But this is the sediments that you get if you, this is what you get if you run the sediments through a sieve. And at first it just looks like a bunch of just random dirt. But let me stick a light on this and zoom in a little bit. And what I want to show you is that if you go through the sediments that are at the dried bottom of a vernal pool, you can see that in the mixture, let me get this in a little tighter, it looks like there's sand, there's little grains of various objects, but in amongst all these little sand grains and all these little dried up remnants of things, you can see that there's a bunch of these little cream colored balls. They're just sort of barely visible here. Now, this would look better under a much higher magnification. but I'm just using the little document camera that goes with my computer. But if you look in this image, you can see that there's these little cream colored balls. If I can get my toothpick in there. And these little balls are in fact the cysts or eggs of fairy shrimp. I'll talk a little bit about why do we call them cysts. It's because there's actually a dried up baby inside. It's not just a little one-celled egg. There's actually a baby shrimp inside this little brown ball all dried up. But you can see that there's a lot of these little guys just mixed in there. And that's the secret to the vernal pool, is that even though the animals are dead and the water is all dried up, all of these little eggs, these little cysts are just sitting in the sediment, just waiting for the triggers to hatch. Usually that trigger is going to be cool water that lasts for a while. And, you know, then they will pop right out and become little baby shrimp. So those are the cysts. Now, I keep a lot of these around. I actually collect sediments from all over the state. And I've got a whole little box in my refrigerator full of cysts of various species. And so I actually did hatch a few things for you guys to look at tonight, so that you can get a chance to see what they look like. It's a very dry year and most people aren't seeing swimming fairy shrimp right now, but hopefully you'll get a chance to see them tonight. So let me go ahead and move on and talk a little bit about the organisms that I want to show you. So there's a lot of, yes, go ahead.
Can you go back and just point to those cysts again?
Sure.
And keep your pointer there for a little longer so we can see them better?
Of course. Let me zoom that in a little bit. I'm zooming in as much as my little camera will tolerate. Here, let me get a little bit of light on that. Yeah, unfortunately, I'm sort of pushing this camera to its max. This isn't really designed for this.
That's okay if you can just point to it again and hold the stick there.
Sure. So like right here at the end of my toothpick, do you see that little tiny kind of brownish tan little ball? That is a fairy shrimp cyst right there. So there's like one right there on the end of my toothpick. Here's another one over here. Here's a couple over here. And you can see they're sort of a tannish beige color. They look like little teeny ping pong balls. And there's a little baby in there. I mean, it's hard to believe that there's an actual living little shrimp inside there, but it's dried out, suspended animation, not eating or breathing or really doing anything, and just waiting for its little opportunity to come out. Hopefully that was clear. Sabrina, did that look like it was a little clearer?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
We could see it better when you held the stick very still.
Okay.
And so for those that still might not have seen it too well, they're extremely circular, perfect circles, really.
Yes, yes. Yeah. They're these little balls right here. I'll point one out again. So let's see if I can get my toothpick in the image. Like this little guy right here, right on the end of my toothpick point. You can see that little ball. Looks like a little tiny beige ping pong ball. That is a fairy shrimp waiting to come out. All right, so there's a lot of organisms that go in vernal pools. I mean, if you start netting around in a vernal pool, you find seed shrimp, clam shrimp, daphnia, all sorts of things, water fleas. But the two that I want to really focus on tonight, because they're the most famous and they're the ones with the legal protection that we have to be concerned about, are fairy shrimp and tadpole shrimp. Those are the ones that I want to sort of focus on. So I want to start with fairy shrimp. And actually, me and fairy shrimp and I, to be grammatically correct, go back a long way. I actually have probably 50 years of experience, almost 40 years of experience with fairy shrimp. And it dates clear back to my childhood, and I'll show you why. Let me get this out of the way. So some of you guys may remember this, okay? If you're the right age bracket, you may actually recall this. But this is something that they still do today, but this caught my eye. So years ago, probably about 1977 or so, when I was about 10 years old, I became aware of comic books, and I also became aware of the whole idea that you could send away in the mail for things. I think when I was about 10, this is when it dawned on me. And I would see this ad in the back of comic books. Send in your $1.25 and they'll send you some sea monkeys. And it just seemed really bizarre to me as a kid, as a 10-year-old. I'm like, what are those little guys? And so I sent in my money and I waited my 4 to 6 weeks. Everything took 4 to 6 weeks back then. And eventually I got in the mail a little package of sea monkey eggs. And I put them in the water and mixed them up, followed the directions, and it worked for me. And I actually ended up with a batch of sea monkeys. So they're a classic little toy. And I didn't know what they were at the time. I thought they were fascinating, these little guys that just sort of pop out of nowhere from a little package of powder. Later, I actually figured out what they were. They're actually a kind of fairy shrimp. They're actually a brine shrimp. But this was my exposure to fairy shrimp. And it basically started a lifelong love of fairy shrimp. So this is where it all began. So to kind of show you what sea monkeys actually are, let me pull up a diagram here. So sea monkeys, the classic little toy, are in fact a variety of fairy shrimp. And so for many people, this is their first exposure to fairy shrimp. It was certainly my first exposure to fairy shrimp. And what I realized later, after I'd grown them and learned a little bit more about them, I kind of figured out how they actually work. And so it turns out that they are, in fact, a kind of shrimp. Okay, I'll explain more about what makes them a shrimp and how they fit in the grand picture of things. But they do come in males and females. There's the males. This is a male over here. Males have these giant claspers on the front of their head that they use to grab the female with. And then the female has this little egg sac down here where she produces her eggs. She's going to make these eggs. They begin to develop, and they actually develop into a little baby. There's a tiny little embryonic shrimp in that little shell, and then it goes dormant. And that's actually why they're sometimes called cysts instead of eggs, because it's not just a single cell in there. It's an actual dormant embryonic shrimp. And they can go dry. And when they're in their dry state, they can remain perfectly viable in their dried state for years and years and years. We don't even really know what the limit on longevity on shrimp is. And brine shrimp in particular are known to last a really long time, years and years. But you give them the right conditions, the right water, temperature, salinity, oxygen levels, and they immediately hatch out into little babies. It's like a 24-hour process, and then they begin to grow. And so this is what brine shrimp look like in diagram form, but I want to show you the real ones. So if any of you have never had the pleasure of growing sea monkeys, these are in fact sea monkeys. So this is what you get when you send in your $1.25, although I think these days it's probably a lot more than $1.25. But if you send in your money and wait your time and get your thing in the mail, this is what you will hatch. So this, what you're looking at right now, is a small dish of sea monkeys. These are technically the San Francisco fairy shrimp, the San Francisco brine shrimp. The scientific name is Artemia franciscana, the San Francisco brine shrimp. They're actually a very common species in California. They occur in many different salty pools around the state, including Mono Lake and up along the San Andreas Fault. But if you've ever flown out of San Francisco Airport, down at the south end of San Francisco Bay, there are those giant salt ponds where they evaporate seawater to make salt. And these are full of brine shrimp. And in fact, from the air, sometimes those ponds are bright red. And that bright red coloration is actually billions and billions of little tiny shrimp. So when you look at these live shrimp, you can see a couple of things. Number one, you can see why they're called fairy shrimp, because they look like they have little delicate wings. So it's a really good example of why they have that name. So if you pick out an individual shrimp and kind of focus on it, you can see that they're very delicate, they're very graceful, and they do in fact look like they have little fairy wings on them, which is where they get their name. So this is an interesting species because they live in salt water. They're native California shrimp. and they illustrate how the shrimp operate. So fairy shrimp are, in fact, one of the oldest creatures around. Fossils of the fairy shrimp date back to the Ordovician period, which is something like 450 million years. Makes them older than dinosaurs. In fact, older than almost anything with bones. So if you think of any animal with a skeleton, these are older than that. And as far as the body design, it really couldn't be any simpler. They're really not much more than a swimming intestine. It's just a long cylindrical body. They have eyes on the front. They have their little swimming legs. They swim through the water and basically just eat anything that fits in their mouth. So any particle or object that they can fit in their mouth, they will swallow. They're not discriminating. In fact, if you offer them the appropriate size of plastic beads, they will eat those just as readily as anything else. But they basically are filter feeders. So they swallow whatever they can find. It passes through their intestine. It comes out the other end within a few minutes. And that's basically it. And as you can see, there's not much to them in terms of a defense system. They have no shell, no protection. They're not particularly fast. They're not particularly good at dodging predators. And so they're basically just swimming fish food. And so one of the things that makes fairy shrimp interesting is that over the millions of years that they've been evolving, they have done their darndest to avoid fish. Fairy shrimp and fish are not compatible in any way, shape, or form. So fairy shrimp have gone out of their way to avoid fish. And how do you avoid fish? Well, you either live in really, really salty water that the fish can't tolerate, or you live in water that dries up seasonally because fish don't survive drying up. So the entire life strategy of the fairy shrimp is built around avoiding fish, trying to stay away from fish. Now, another thing to notice in this particular species is that if you look close, you'll see that there's a couple of individuals in here that look like they are two individuals joined together. For example, there's a couple over here. You can see these, there's a male and a female over here. This species is interesting in that the males use those giant claspers on the front of their head to physically grab the female and hold on to her for a long period of time. This is actually a reproductive strategy. By holding on to her continuously, he can continuously mate with her over a long period of time and prevent other males from mating with her. So by hanging on to her like that, as you can see here, he is ensuring that all of her babies are his babies, which is, you know, genetically a good strategy. So this is the San Francisco brine shrimp. It is a fairy shrimp. This was my first encounter with the fairy shrimp world. This is the first shrimp that I ever grew, and I still grow them today. So I've been growing sea monkeys on and off for 40-something years, and it just gives me immense pleasure to grow these. But now, these days, I grow many other species as well, and I'm going to show you some of those as well. So that's the brine shrimp. But here in California, we have a lot of different shrimp. So I want to show you guys a little list. And by the way, at the end of the show, if you want to come back and see some of these again, just let me know and I'll stick it back under the camera and you can take another look. But this is one of my favorites. This is the San Francisco brine shrimp. So now here in California, though, we actually have a lot of fairy shrimp. Okay, it turns out, and we'll go over this in a bit more later, California is one of the global hot spots for fairy shrimp. In fact, around the planet, there's probably about 4 or 5 hot spots of fairy shrimp, and we're one of them. And what makes us a hot spot for fairy shrimp is our Mediterranean climate. Eva Butler may have talked about that when she was doing her presentation. But the fact that we have these long, hot, dry summers and these short, wet, mild winters, that's why we have vernal pools, and it's why we have so many fairy shrimp. So here in the state of California, we have something like 25 species of fairy shrimp, and they're all over the place. They're from ranging from sea level to high altitude, from snow melt, crystal clear water to thick, salty water, and everything in between. So any variety of habitat that you can think of, there's a fairy shrimp that's probably taking advantage of it. Now, of the 25 species, only a handful are legally protected. So for example, out at Jepson Prairie, we have the Conservancy fairy shrimp, Branchianecta conservatio. That's an endangered species. Over in the Grasslands Regional Park, there's Branchianecta lynchi, which is a threatened species, not technically endangered, but a threatened species. But other places in the state, there are some other species that are also endangered. The Longhorn fairy shrimp, Branchianecta longiantenna, down on the Carrizo Plain is an endangered species. The San Diego fairy shrimp, Branchianecta San Diegoensis, is an endangered species. And the Riverside, okay, Streptocephalus wooteni. Actually, I feel really sorry for the Riverside fairy shrimp. It only lives in about 4 pools in all of the world, and all of them are surrounded by development in the Riverside area. So it's got a tough road ahead of it, and may or may not make it. But these are just a kind of a list of the fairy shrimp that we have. Now, what I want to show you guys is the ones that are most likely to show up around here. Okay, so if you do go to Grasslands Regional Park or Mather Field, or some of the other ones, Jepson Prairie Preserve, you're not going to find the brine shrimp. You're not going to find those sea monkeys that I showed you. What you're more likely to run into is a Branchianecta. Now, a Branchianecta is a very different kind of animal, okay? And I want to show you some of those. So let me show you some males of Branchianecta lindali. This is the versatile fairy shrimp that I have hatched for you guys to look at. So this is the way that they look in my cultures, okay? And let me turn this light down a little bit. It's too bright. And I'll zoom in a little bit so you can kind of take a look. I'll isolate one in just a minute. You can get a better look at it. But this animal that you're looking at now, this is Branchianecta lindali, which is commonly known as the versatile fairy shrimp. And the reason it's called the versatile fairy shrimp is that it's really not very picky about its habitats. It lives anywhere from sea level to up in the mountains. It'll tolerate anything from fresh water to quite salty. And so it's really not that picky about its habitats. But you'll notice it's a couple things different than the brine shrimp. It's a bigger shrimp. And actually lindali is at least 2 to 3 times the size of a typical sea monkey, of a typical brine shrimp. And so if you're in one of those grassland vernal pools that you would find in the Yolo Basin area or in the Solana County area, you're going to find a Branchianecta. So they do get quite big. In fact, Branchianecta is one of the largest fairy shrimps in California. Out at Jepson Prairie, we have the Branchianecta conservatio, which is a very big shrimp. That's in the 1 inch to 1.5 inch category. And then up in the mountains, you can find Branchianecta gigas, which is over 3 inches long. And there are actually reports of shrimp, of Branchianecta gigas, that's the giant fairy shrimp, that are in the 4 to 5 inch range, that's crazy for a fairy shrimp. But it's a much bigger shrimp than the brine shrimp, and more likely what you would find in this area in the Sacramento Valley. So these are some males, and unfortunately, because I have to culture them in water that's good for their environment, it's a little bit murky. So what I want to do is I want to isolate one male so we can see a little better at it. By the way, I know I can't see the chat window right now. Sabrina's taking a look at it. But Sabrina, if you see any questions that are like particularly relevant to what I'm talking about at the moment, feel free to chime in.
Okay. How long can the cysts stay viable if rain does not come?
That is actually a really good question. And to be perfectly honest, I would say that I don't think anybody really knows for sure. We do know for sure that we're talking years and decades. People have collected cysts, kept them dry in shelves and in refrigerators and on lab counters and things for decades, and they still hatch. Probably they can last a lot longer than that. A fairy shrimp cyst in a dark, cool, dry place, doesn't really have any expiration date. I mean, there's no reason why a fairy shrimp cyst should not be viable after 100 years. I would easily say that in a dry, dark place, a cyst would stay viable for probably a century, would be my guess. But honestly, nobody really knows, because how do you do research on that? You know, you have to keep an egg for 100 years and see if it still hatches. People have drilled brine shrimp cysts out of the side of the Great Salt Lake in Utah, and some of those cysts appear to be viable after hundreds of years underground. So it's a long, long time. All right, so this animal that you're looking at now, this is an isolated male Branchynecta. This is a versatile fairy shrimp, which is very similar to Branchynecta lynchi, which is the one at Grasslands Regional Park, very similar to Branchynecta conservatio, which is the one at Jepson Prairie. And what I want you to see on this one, if you look close, is look at these claspers on his head. So if you look at his head, you can see he's got these long, long, long appendages. Sometimes people think they look like giant fangs. I kind of think they look like walrus tusks. If you look at his head, it almost looks like he's a walrus with giant tusks dragging along. But those appendages, which are actually modified antennas, they're antennas that have been modified into the shape. Those are actually sexual claspers. They use those claspers for grabbing hold of the female so that they can mate with them. And so the Branchynecta are not long-term claspers like the brine shrimp are. The males will swim down low in the water, upside down, waiting for a female to swim by, and then they come up from below, grab her by surprise, and mate with her quickly, and then let go and swim off and look for another one. It's not very romantic. It's a little rapey, but you know, that is the way that these organisms function, and it seems to work. So it's an interesting feature of this genus. This genus is known for these gigantic claspers, and some of them are huge. Down in the Carrizo Plain, there's a shrimp called Branchynecta longiantenna, the longhorn fairy shrimp, and it has claspers that are the length of its entire body. They reach clear to the tip of its tail, and they're just amazing little animals. Protected, obviously endangered. I can't grow them, unfortunately. I wish I could, but they're an amazing animal and really beautiful to look at. But it's distinctive. Now, for taxonomic purposes, the identification of Branchynecta is usually based on the shape and structure of these claspers. So if you wanted to know which species of Branchynecta you had, you would get out a dissecting scope and you would look at those claspers under a microscope, and particularly the ends of the claspers. Different species look a little different on the end. So this is a male. Okay, so let me put him back because he's, so I don't stress him out too much. And let me show you some females.
CJ, while you're putting back the male, a question came in about these specific shrimp.
Okay.
I thought I froze, so I waited a second. Is this the shrimp that we see on the surface of a dried pool? Are they dead mothers with eggs inside?
Probably not, because when fairy shrimp die, they virtually disintegrate. I mean, they're really not made of much more than just a little bit of protein and some water. And when fairy shrimp die, they just disintegrate. So there's really no trace of the adult fairy shrimp left. And the cysts are down in the mud. So it's not you would see on the surface. What you're likely to see on the surface of a dried vernal pool would be clam shrimp, the dead bodies with the eggs inside, and seed shrimp, the dead bodies with the eggs inside, and also the shed shells of tadpole shrimp. That's what you're likely to see. I hope that answered the question, but please ask again if you're not sure. So what you're looking at now, these are females of Branchynecta lindali, the versatile fairy shrimp. And as you can see, a little bit different look. They're slimmer, darker, don't have those claspers. And if you look very closely at the middle of their body, I'm going to show you an isolated female here in a moment. They have an egg sac there's a little brood pouch in the center of their body where they actually store their eggs. And you can see the eggs going through different stages of development. So for example, there's a female, I'll point her out here, that's sort of yellowish. It's this one over here, the sort of yellowish coloration. She's got a batch of unfertilized eggs in her pouch. They come out of her ovaries, kind of a yellow color, and they go into the brood pouch. When she mates with a male and those eggs get fertilized, then she grows a dark, hard protein shell around them, and they turn kind of a brownish, reddish color. And for example, like one of these darker ones over here. So let me show you an isolated female so you can see that a little better. So this is a single female Branchionectolindali in a little bit clearer water so that you can see better. Let me see if I can get it positioned and focused a little better. There we go. And you can actually see the little cysts in her pouch. So inside of her egg sac, you can see there's probably about 30, 40 little tan colored eggs in her pouch. So those are ready to be dropped. Those are ready to be laid. And they can actually make a batch of these eggs almost every day. So she'll make a batch of eggs, mate with a male, push those eggs out. They fall to the bottom. They land at the bottom in the mud. And then she'll keep making more, mate again, and make another batch of eggs. So in her lifetime, she can make quite a few babies, quite a few cysts. Now, what's interesting, though, is that those cysts have some really odd internal timing mechanisms. Sometimes they hatch right away, like within another year or two. So some of those eggs will hatch like the next year or in 2 years. They'll hatch very quickly. But some of those cysts, and for reasons we don't really completely understand, they won't hatch right away. They'll wait for years and years and years before they finally decide to hatch. So in a way, she's sending some of these babies off into the future. So laying them now, but not having them actually hatch and grow for potentially decades. It's a wonderful survival strategy. If something was to go wrong with the vernal pool, if the rains were to stop for a while, if there was a long drought, if some predator showed up and ate all the vernal pool organisms, there would still be a bank of cysts waiting for their opportunity. And it could be years. It could be years and years and years down the road before they finally decide to hatch out. So this is going to ensure a continuous supply of baby shrimp from now and clear on into many centuries into the future. So a very elegant species. I think Branchionectolindali is a nice looking species. And also, from my perspective, no legal status. So they're not threatened, they're not endangered, and this is why I can grow them. So it's perfectly legal to collect versatile fairy shrimp, to grow them, to harvest them, to culture them, and this is why I use them as a sample, an example organism. All right. If you have any questions about that, please let Sabrina know, and she'll pass those on to me. But that was my little coverage of fairy shrimp, and now I would actually like to switch gears to probably my other favorite organism. If I had to pick one, it'd be really hard, but definitely fairy shrimp are up there. But the next critter that I have to show you guys, I think is actually probably equally cool, maybe cooler, okay? So we've been talking so far about fairy shrimp, but now let me show you another little animal, which is the tadpole shrimp.
CJ, would you like to answer a few more vernal fairy?
Yes, go ahead. I'm switching gears here, so yeah, go ahead.
Excuse me, vernal pool fairy shrimp questions while you're pulling out tadpole shrimp?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. There's a question of, someone said it sounds as if there are both saltwater and freshwater fairy shrimps. Is that correct? And are there different species of saltwater ones as well?
Yes. So yes, there are saltwater and freshwater fairy shrimps. There's some of them that are only saltwater, like Artemia. Artemia, the brine shrimps, strictly saltwater. And in fact, the saltier, the better. They'll live in water that is much saltier than anything that any fish could tolerate, which is how they avoid fish. And then there's other species of fairy shrimp, particularly some of the desert species, the beaver tails, things like that, that can tolerate a wide variety of salinities. On the other hand, there are some other fairy shrimp that are really not very tolerant of salt. The Riverside fairy shrimp, for example, is really, it requires some clearer, cleaner, low salinity water. So there are both freshwater and saltwater fairy shrimp, and several species in each category. For example, in the Artemia, there's Artemia franciscana, which is the San Francisco fairy shrimp in the San Francisco Bay, and that's the one that they sell as sea monkeys. But there's actually also Artemia monica, which is the Mono Lake brine shrimp, which is actually a completely different species and lives in Mono Lake. So that was the salt fresh one. Was there another question besides the salt and the fresh? I'm switching my pictures here.
Sure. Yes. So when it gets wet again, how would I find one in the wild? And can I just scoop up some water and get one?
Yes. Well, there's two pieces to that question. The first question, how do you find them? If you know a low spot that gathers water and you wait for a heavy drenching rain and watch the pool fill up, if you go out to a freshly filled pool about 2 weeks after it's filled, you can probably start dipping things out of there. Fairy shrimp, tadpole shrimp, seed shrimp, things like that. However, and this is where the docent in me has to kind of like just caution people, because we do have some listed species in California, you do need to be a little bit careful about where you stick your net. For example, no one other than permitted docents is allowed to put a net anywhere in any water at Jepson Prairie, because we have Conservancy fairy shrimp. So you do have to be a little bit mindful of where you are and what water you're sticking your net in. If it looks like it's a preserve or any kind of thing like that, then no. But if you're driving down the highway and you see a roadside ditch or cattle pond or something on the side of the railroad track, that's fair game. That's fair game. And in fact, my original colony of versatile fairy shrimp came from the side of the railroad track in Davis over by H Street. I used to live in an apartment over on H Street by the railroad track, and that's where my original starter colony of versatile fairy shrimp came from. And that's fair game. Anyone can stick a net in there. All right.
I will add, as you pull out the tadpole shrimp, to add to that question, the vernal pools at Grasslands Regional Park are gated and protected and not accessible to the public.
Mm-hmm.
And that is one of the reasons why we're doing this educational.
Right. Excellent. All right. So let me move on to the next animal.
About them. So people know that this is there, and you stay out of that area because it's protected and you want to see it continue to thrive and be protected. I'm going to let you pull out those tadpole shrimp. It looks like you're ready, and we'll take more questions after.
Okay. All right. So here's the next animal I want to show you guys. It is called a tadpole shrimp. It's related to the fairy shrimp in the sense that they're all varieties of vernal pool shrimp, but a very different body plan. So tadpole shrimp, what they have done is, rather than be filter feeders, they've decided to spend their lives on the bottom as bottom feeders. They're omnivorous, meaning they'll eat almost anything. They'll eat plants, animals, dead things. They'll even bite on each other. And their body is covered with a hard protein-based shell, a carapace. And they're an interesting animal. Okay, I'm just going to show you some in just a second. Now, what's interesting about tadpole shrimp is that, unlike fairy shrimp, there is not a lot of diversity when it comes to tadpole shrimp. There's only about 10 species in the entire planet of tadpole shrimp, and there's only 2 kinds. I mean, there's only 2 genera of tadpole shrimp. There's Lepiduris, which is the native California one, and there's Triops. Triops is a more tropical variety. but it does occur in California in rice paddies. It's actually been introduced into California as a somewhat invasive pest. So of the two varieties, Lepiduris is protected, Lepiduris pachyderdi. That's a listed, federally listed species, but Triops is not. So I am not allowed to collect or cultivate or show Lepiduris, but I am allowed to show Triops. So let me show you some. All right, so I don't know how many of you guys have had experience looking at tadpole shrimp, but they're a pretty cool animal. I mean, that you have to admit, that is just kind of a cool looking creature. They're sort of prehistoric looking. They look something like a horseshoe crab. Sometimes people are like, ooh, I think that looks like a horseshoe crab, or maybe a trilobite. If you've ever seen a fossil trilobite, they do have a sort of a superficial resemblance to trilobites. Now, just as with the fairy shrimp, I actually have a long history with tadpole shrimp, because when I was about 12, this would have been like 1979 or so, my father was a diplomat with the United States State Department in the Foreign Service. And as a kid, because my father was in the Foreign Service, he got stationed to various embassies around the world. And I basically had to pack up and move with my family and my sister to a new country every 2 years. And in 1979, my father was stationed in North Yemen, which today is just Yemen, but back then was North Yemen. I know a lot of people don't really like Yemen as a country, and currently it's mired in a disastrous civil war, which is criminal, but that's a different issue. But when I was in Yemen, I spent my time just wandering around looking at the local habitats. And one of the things that I found in Yemen were these ancient water cisterns. And these things date back millennia. They could have been 2,000 years old, some of these water cisterns. And every once in a while, in the bottoms of these ancient cisterns, I would find these. And as a 12-year-old kid, finding a writhing mass of these creatures in the bottom of a pool was just like Christmas. I thought they were the most amazing things. They were just incredibly cool. They looked cool. They looked fun. They're so active. They're so bright. And when I first saw these as a 12-year-old, I didn't even know what they were, but I knew they were cool. So I gathered some up and I took them home and I kept them as pets, and I loved them. And it took me a while to figure out what they were. I thought they were baby, horseshoe crabs or something. Eventually, I figured out that they were tadpole shrimp, and I learned about how did they grow and how do they live. And once I figured out that you can grow these on your own anytime you want, well, that was amazing. I mean, once I realized that you can have triops anytime you want, that was just like a gift from the gods for me. I mean, I love these little guys. Now, ironically, years and years later, when I graduated from college, I went to Davis to get my teaching credential. And at some point, it probably would have been about, I don't know, maybe 97, 98 or so, somebody told me, I was talking about these, somebody said, well, there's a bunch of these out at Jepson, Prairie. And I had to go get a map and figure out where Jepson, Prairie was. And I took a trip out there one winter, and there they were. Okay, now they weren't triops, they were Lepiduris, but there they were. So my childhood friends swimming in a vernal pool at Jepson, Prairie, that's actually what made me sign up to be a docent. So I've been a docent at Jepson, Prairie since 1998, mostly because of these guys. So as you're looking at these creatures swimming around, you can see that they are big animals, very active, very robust, interesting colors. You notice all the red on there. They have a lot of red on them. Their feet are red, their antennas are red. All of that red is actually hemoglobin, which is the same chemical that makes our blood red. It's kind of an interesting coincidence. Obviously, we're not related to tadpole shrimp, but there's only so many ways that you can carry oxygen in blood. And this is one of them, is to use hemoglobin. So they're fascinating little animals. You can see they've got big eyes. They're very vigorous, flat shells. And I actually want to very temporarily, I want to flip one over for you. They don't exactly like this, but it doesn't hurt them. but I want to flip one over so you can see the bottom side real quick. And whoops. They're not really happy about this. They don't like this. But if you look at the bottom of them, put the little guy back. Actually, there's a couple upside down ones right there. You can see that they've got a whole set, like 20, 30 little red legs. Those red legs are multi-purpose. They use them to swim, they use them to breathe, and they function like gills, and they also use them for gathering food. So a couple weird things about these guys. This species doesn't really have a lot of males. It's very common to dip into a pool and not find any males at all. You can have entire female populations that are self-fertile, or they have the ability to fertilize each other, which makes them hermaphrodites. They're like females that can make sperm, but a lot of times they'll be only female species. But they do a very similar thing to the fairy shrimp. They hatch in the winter rains, grow very quickly, and scavenge all over the bottom of the pool. When the pool dries up, the adult shrimp die, the cysts go down in the mud, and they're just ready to come back next year. So amazing little creatures. Now, I wish I could grow Lepiduris. Lepiduris, the ones that actually occur at Grassland Regional Preserve or Regional Park, and out at Jepson, Prairie, places like that, Lepiduris has a very different look. It's a longer, more oval shrimp, more tinted. The carapace, if you can imagine, the carapace is more tinted up at the top, as opposed to these Triops. Triops tend to be kind of flatter and disc shaped, and more of an olive green with red tinge to them. Lepiduris is more of a browny tan color. It'd be interesting to do a side by side, but Lepiduris packardi, the vernal pool tadpole shrimp, that is a federally listed species. And as I said, I am not allowed to collect, cultivate, or keep it. So I'm allowed to dip it as a docent, but just for temporary viewing purposes. So I do have one other thing I want to show you guys really quick, but did anyone have any questions about these little tadpole shrimp while they're still on the screen?
Yes. What determines the colors of the tadpole shrimp's carapace?
I suspect a lot of it has to do with what they're eating and the conditions that they're in. So usually if they're in really murky water, they're usually paler because it's darker. And in shallower, clearer water, they're usually darker colored. But a lot of it, I think, depends on what they're eating. I'm feeding mine a pretty rich, high protein diet, and that's why they have this pretty rich green coloration with the red feet. The ones at Jepson Prairie, for example, are usually browner and paler. So I think it's diet and the turbidity of the water.
Why do they keep coming up to the surface?
Oh, it's a foraging aspect. They do forage along the bottom of the water, but they will also come up to the surface, go upside down, and actually rake along the bottom of the water in order to catch anything that may be floating on the surface. So any bugs that fell in the water, debris that fell in the water, they'll actually rake along the surface and look for that. Plus, they're just hyper. they're a really hyper animal. They never stop moving. They just swim, cartwheel around. They're quite entertaining. I could watch them for a long time.
This is awesome. There's another question. How do you tell the difference between a Lepiduris and a Triops?
Very good question. I forgot to mention that. It's a subtle difference. It's the tails, really. So if you look at these guys, it's a little hard to tell, but every once in a while you can see that at the end of their tail, they have two prongs. They have these two long filaments that stick off of their back of their tail. On a Triops, that's all there is. It's just the tail and there's the two filaments. On a Lepiduris, there's a little clear plate in between those two filaments. It's called a supraanal plate. And I'm not really sure what it does, but it's there. And so if you look at a Lepiduris, there's this little brown flap, like a little paddle, in between their two tail filaments. And that is the key distinguishing feature between a Triops and a Lepiduris.
Great, you answered another question with that answer too. Thank you. And what do you feed your fairy shrimp and tadpole shrimp?
So my fairy shrimp are filter feeders, and so I usually feed them yeast. They're very fond of yeast. It's the right size for them. I kind of spoil mine. I actually go buy expensive champagne yeast because champagne yeast has higher protein than cheap yeast you get at the grocery store. So I do spoil mine a little bit with the champagne yeast, so they have a little bit of a spa going on in there. And yeast works great for fairy shrimp. For tadpole shrimp, I use a variety of tropical fish foods, like pellets and things that I grind up and feed them. But they'll eat almost anything. You can throw in lunch scraps, whatever. My kids will throw in pieces of bologna and all sorts of stuff, and they'll eat that. So they're really quite omnivorous. They'll eat almost anything you throw in there. Sabrina, did you have any more questions? Or
CJ, I'll let you show
I just
your next item, and then we can.
Yeah, I just had one little wrap up real quick.
Yeah, of course. Please share.
Yeah, okay.
And then we'll take some more questions after that.
Oh, yes. No, I'll definitely answer questions.
Yes.
But I did want to wrap up with this. So the last thing I wanted to kind of leave people with is a little bit about the rarity, legality, and the need for protection of fairy shrimp and tadpole shrimp. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, California is one of the world hotspots of fairy shrimp. This is called hotspots of anostracan biodiversity. Anostraca is the family name of fairy shrimp. Fairy shrimp are anostraca. And of the entire world, there's about 5 hotspots. South Africa, one of the hotspots, West Coast US, Southwest Australia, Argentina, and Italy and Southeast France. Of course, what's the common feature? All Mediterranean climates. So they're all about 40 degrees north or south on the west coasts of continents and have very similar climates. So long, hot summers, short, wet, mild winters. And so we here in the west coast of the United States, we are one of the global hotspots, which means, you know, we have a lot of species we need to protect. Now, when it comes to protecting vernal pools, though, this is I always like to show this picture just because it's such a gorgeous picture, and I kind of forget who took it, but it's such a wonderful picture. When it comes to protecting vernal pools, one of the things that I do like to stress is that it's not enough to just put a fence around the pool. Sometimes people think, well, we'll just, you know, put a little perimeter fence around the pool and we did our job. And actually you haven't. A vernal pool is really part of a much larger ecosystem. Really, a vernal pool is just the very bottom water collecting spot of a much larger region. There's usually a bigger area, a grassland, or some kind of a plateau or something. And so if you really want to protect a vernal pool, you can't just protect the water. You have to protect the entire region, the entire area. And unfortunately, vernal pools tend to lie in flat, developable land. And so when humans show up, the land where vernal pools tends to be really good spots for building freeways and houses and shopping malls and department stores and all that kind of stuff. So the land that they sit on is highly valuable real estate. And unfortunately, that means that we have lost a lot of our vernal pools. I'm going to show you guys a map. I don't know if Eva showed you guys this map last time, but it's a really good map. This map was compiled by data put together by Carol Witham and Bob Holland. Carol Witham's actually going to be one of your speakers here pretty soon on vernal pool flowers. And of course, Bob Holland is the late, great soil expert. But this map indicates the remaining vernal pool areas in California as of 2012. Before the arrival of humans, and particularly before the arrival of Westerners, Western Europeans, most of the valley floor was vernal pool habitat. I mean, almost the entire Sacramento Valley was just one vast vernal pool habitat. But because of construction, development, farming, agriculture, very, very little is left. In fact, people estimate that something like 90% of all the vernal pool habitat in California is gone, permanently gone. And that's just tragic. And so what that really tells us is that this remaining portion, this remaining 10%, this is vital. We need to protect it, preserve it, and conserve it for future generations. Now, fortunately, there are some sites around that do that. I work at Jepson Prairie, which is a preserve. The Grasslands Regional Park is preserved. Mather Field and some of the others, are preserved. But there's a lot of this land is not preserved. It is still threatened with development. And so as a docent and as a fairy shrimp fanatic, I just like to emphasize to everybody in the public and in government that we have an obligation. We have a moral obligation to protect what's left and protect these animals for future generations. And anything we can do to do that is a good thing. All right. That was basically my talk, but at this point, I'd be happy to take any and all questions that anybody has. And if anybody wants to see animals again, let me know and I'll put it back under the camera.
Great. CJ, if you want to go ahead and do a stop share screen there.
There we go.
Then I can have us both spotlighted and I can give you some more questions.
Okay.
So another one for you. When we have very little rain, such as right now, and we get a minor amount of rain, hatch immediately, or how much water do they need? Is there a temperature factor in that? It's a big one.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if anybody knows completely for sure all those details, but I know that there are some species that will hatch almost immediately. As soon as you get any kind of water and any kind of ponding, some things will start to hatch. The little flashy ones, the Lindariella, the little red-eyed California fairy shrimp that likes to live in grassy pools, Branchionecta lynchi, things like that, they will hatch quite quickly because they're able to grow fast. But some of the species like Branchionecta conservatio, the Conservancy fairy shrimp, they are slow growing and they will not hatch unless they get adequately deep and adequately cold water. So it needs to be cold, it needs to be deep, and it needs to last a while before they'll even bother hatching. Otherwise, they run the risk of wasting their generation.
What is the lifespan of both an adult fairy shrimp and an adult tadpole shrimp?
Well, once again, it's going to vary a little bit by the species. Some of those guys are really flashy. They'll hatch, grow, reach sexual maturity quickly. I mean, like the ones that I showed you, Branchionecta lindali, the versatile fairy shrimp, those will go from hatchling to sexually mature in about 14 days, which is really fast. And then they don't last much longer after that. You might get a couple more weeks, but I'd say about a month, and then they're done. They're finished. They just age out and drop dead. Other species like the Conservatio, Conservatio will hatch out in the winter rains in like November, December, and they'll keep going as long as there's deep, cool water. So, and we'll keep catching them clear into, March. So you're talking 3-4 months that they could be swimming around. Tadpole shrimp are probably about in the middle. I'd say you probably get a couple months out of a tadpole shrimp, but that's about it. And even when I grow them, I mean, I take wonderful care of my tadpole shrimp. And even then you probably only get about 6 to 7 weeks and then they just die. They just get old.
In your shrimp containers in the Petri dishes, there was was that fecal matter or just organic matter floating around?
It's probably mostly fecal pellets because they've been in there for, I hatched or scooped them out probably a couple hours ago. And so if they spend some time in a container, you get these a collection of little fecal pellets on the bottom. That's probably what people were seeing. Or cysts. I mean, if you keep the females around for a while, they start dropping cysts in your Petri dish. So.
Great. Is wildfire a risk to their survival?
I would say probably not, because usually wildfire season, the pools are dry and the cysts are in the mud. And so if the cysts are in dried mud, they're probably almost immune to fire. It's not going to burn across the mud flat, and they're preserved. So I would say probably not. Wildfire is probably really almost no concern for fairy shrimp.
Why are these species threatened and endangered?
Ah, excellent. It's an interesting dilemma, because on the one hand, they live forever, and they have cysts that live for decades and decades. So you'd think they'd be tough. It's the lack of the proper environment. They will only hatch in the right water conditions and in the right temperatures and salinities and things. And so if you destroy the pool, if you destroy the water that they're in, you lose the species. So even though there's thousands of years of embedded cysts in the mud, if there's no water for them to hatch into, then that species is basically gone. So the current danger to all the fairy shrimp in California is habitat loss and destruction.
Can these cysts or live fairy shrimp and tadpole shrimp be injured if cows or humans walk on them?
Well, that's an interesting thing, and I've actually thought about that, because when you look at a lot of dried up vernal pools, a lot of animals tromp through them all the time. I mean, in the past it was tule elk tromping through there, and now it's cows tromping through there and sheep tromping through there. I would imagine that they do some damage to the cysts and things, but I would think overall, wildlife walking through the vernal pool is probably not a big concern. There's so many cysts. I mean, there's thousands and thousands of cysts in the mud. And so even if they did kill a few, it's probably not making a big difference. The more concerning thing would be, what are they leaving in the pool? If it's grazing sheep, it's probably just, little poop pellets or something. But cows drop a lot of fecal matter, and that can really cruddy up a vernal pool pretty quickly. So I'd be more concerned about the cow poop than the stomping. So
you had mentioned how California is a hot spot for vernal pools. Are there many?
Sabrina, I think I missed the end of that question. It glitched out a little bit.
Okay. Are there many vernal pools located outside of California?
Oh yeah, there's vernal pools all over the world. They occur in many different climates, in many different places. So, for example, the first time I ever saw tadpole shrimp was in Yemen, in the Arabian Peninsula, and you wouldn't expect that to be a vernal pool habitat. But there are pools in other places and in other climates. For example, even in places like Thailand, there's several interesting species of fairy shrimp in Thailand that tend to live in rice paddies. Rice paddies is kind of the equivalent of a vernal pool. So they do occur many places around the world, Africa, Asia, many spots. I was just showing you the hot spots where there were concentrations of large numbers of vernal pools and vernal pool species.
Okay, last question here. What happens if excess stormwater runoff gets into a vernal pool during the dry phase too?
I missed a little bit of that. So was the question, what happens if excess storm water runs off into a dry vernal pool?
Yes.
Well, hard to say. If it's at the wrong time, it probably wouldn't have much effect, because if the water's too warm, most of the species are not going to hatch, and then the water would just dry up and they would just go back to their regular cycle. But if a bunch of water went into a dried vernal pool and fooled the shrimp and tricked them into hatching at the inappropriate time, they may not be able to complete their cycle. It could be too hot, oxygen levels too low. They may not fulfill their reproductive cycle in the proper way. So.
Great. Well, I'd like to take this time to thank CJ Addington for being our speaker tonight. That That was incredible, CJ. Thank you so much, especially from home right now too. This was a wonderful talk. I think we've all learned so much more. I know I have about vernal pool fairy shrimp and tadpole shrimp. So thank you so much, CJ. Thank you to all of you for joining us from home tonight. And we hope to see you at our next 2 speaker series events at 7 p.m. on Tuesday, April 27th. We'll learn about Grasslands Regional Park history and our burrowing owls. And another quick reminder that on May 11th, Tuesday night at 7 p.m. as well, we'll learn from Carol Witham about the plant species of our local vernal pools. I hope you'll be able to join us for future vernal pool virtual tours. And we also can't wait to get you back out here in person. Our wetland tours of the City of Davis wetlands and the Yolo Bypass Wildlife Area are now available for in-person limited tours, up to 20 registrants per tour. They are still free to you. We do appreciate donations as well. We also are rolling out our BAT programs with in-person features and our summer camps for our youth with in-person programs as well this summer. So stay tuned for more. Thank you all so much. Again, thank you, CJ.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody. Have a great night.